Hi Psychians, welcome back to a new video lecture marathon. And I promise, as these go on, I hope you find enjoyment, and I hope that I am just as interactive as if we would be in class. So buckle up, we're going to take some notes. And for our first video here, we're going to focus on module 60, which is the personality. So our whole unit 7, part 2 is on personality and kind of the different psychological lenses of personality. And we are going to start with our psychoanalytical, and we all know who's the king of psychoanalytical. It is our dear, creepy Freud. So just a fair warning, when we get into Freud's slides, it's going to get a little weird. There's some things that we're just going to get through together, my friends. And again, it's Freud, so what else can we expect? So just preparing yourself, and my little disclaimer. So first things first, what the heck is personality, right? So personality is an individual's characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. And it can be examined through different lenses, which is essentially our Unit 7, Part 2. And so the picture of the 7 dwarves and all of their personalities, right? So I just thought it'd be a great connection. So again, characteristic pattern, thinking, feeling, and acting. And there's different perspectives that we can look at people's personalities through. And for this video lecture, we are going to be looking at Freud. So first things first, Freud. So in his clinical practice, right? So Freud encountered many patients suffering from nervous disorders. Remember, Freud is all about the unconscious and what we can pull out of it. And so he explains personality with a connection to, maybe you're trying to hide some urges, or you are, there's a psychological cause that your parents may have started, right? So again, think of Freud as, the psychoanalytical perspective of what is in our unconscious that might have ripple affected out into our personalities, right? And again, Freud is the first one to really develop a comprehensive personality theory. Do people listen to it? That's a whole nother story, my friends. So here is Sigmund Freud. So again, feel free to pick and pull from this, because we've talked about Freud a lot. And before we dive into Freud's theory, let's look at how this lens looks at personality. So a reservoir, which is our unconscious mind, of mostly, this is what he believed that lives in our unconscious mind, unacceptable thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories, that we have these urges that society may not agree with, right? Or, things that you'd be ashamed of in society. And so Freud's all about pulling that from the unconscious using free association, right? Which is when we would have, so this is actually Freud's chair that he would use. It's in Vienna. And he would sit on the other end right here, and free association is just be like, tell me about something, and they'll start freely talking about stuff, and Freud will dig and try to get at the source of this anxious and anxiety provoking feelings. So yeah, free association, unconscious mind, Freud. So before we dive into theories, we first want to talk about what Freud is very, very well known for. And it's his it's the Iceberg Theory. So he believes that the mind is similar to an iceberg, and there it is. And the largest and most important parts of our personality are at the top. This is our conscious personality, what we currently are aware of and what people see, right? And then there's this pre-conscious, where it's info that we can pull from if we need to, if we really want to think about it. We could say, maybe I'm crabby due to this experience from this experience, right? But then there's the unconscious, which is completely out of our awareness, yet it dictates our behavior. So he believes that the parts of the mind are like an iceberg, and there's 3 parts. There's 3 parts to our personality, and let's look at them. So this is a big slide. Okay, so first we have the structure of personality from a psychoanalytical perspective comes from the id, ego, and superego. To this day, people still use this to reference, and you might have heard it in your English classes about, a book, or if you've ever read Cuckoo's Nest, right? So these are all where we're going to see the Freudian ideas of what our structure of personality looks like, along with what roles they play. So first, we have our id. I know it looks like ID, but it's id. It's our irrational component. It's our compulsive behavior. The id is under the water. It is in our unconscious. So think of the id as your most caveman-like tendencies of your personality. So if you were dictated by your id, you would say, I don't want to go to school today. I just want to relax in bed and hang out. You are completely dictated by what is called the pleasure principle, whatever you want to do. So essentially, it's your caveman-like tendencies, and it's your id, and it lives under the water. It's our unconscious. So when we think of the id, it's our caveman-like feature. It's our caveman-like feature of our personality, where it's all about what we want to do, but we don't think about anything else, right? So it's our caveman-like tendency is our id. We then have, and I'm going to go into ego real quick, but I also want to have, before I talk about ego, I want to talk about the superego. So we have id on one side, and then superego is the exact opposite. So while it is our caveman-like tendencies, our superego is our most moral self. It is our societal rules of what we should be doing. It's everyone else's. So our superego is our moral influence. So when you write superego, I want you to draw. I always like to draw like a little church symbol next to it, because it's our most moral self. So we have our id, which is our most caveman-like self, and then we have our superego, and they have two ideas of what they want to be doing today, right? And how do we balance them? We balance them with our ego. Our ego is our executive mediator, and that is what lives on top of the iceberg that everyone sees. So the superego and the id, right, are below, and when we see the ego, that's why the iceberg is an example. We only see a certain amount of who we are, right, when we're hanging out with people, and the ego is our rational component that mediates the reality principle of the reality of what we can do. So giving you a scenario, say that, Sally wakes up in the morning and her id would say, oh, don't go to school. You can't go to, we would rather go binge watch Criminal Minds for the rest of our life instead of going to school, right? But then it's almost like having the id as the devil, and then our superego is our angel saying, well, you need to go to school because you need to get your degree. Your parents are blah, 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 right? Society makes you want to do it. And so our ego, who is our main mediator, is like, okay, so maybe I'll be a little late to school. Maybe I'll go be a little late to school, and I can binge watch Criminal Minds on the bus ride over, and then I can still make it, right? So your ego is the one that's rationalizing the two urges. So we have superego, right, which is our moral, it's our angel on our shoulder, and then imagine the id as our devil on our shoulder. So again, the ego is what mediates it. And this is Freud's structure personality, his theory, this is the psychoanalytical perspective. Right? So again, all about the unconscious and what's outside of our awareness. But again, the id, ego, and superego, Freud is really well known for this concept. And so again, as we learn about Freud, some things were hit and miss, but some things he really got right? So hence why we still learn about him to this day. So now that we have gone through those, my people, we're at the stage. If you want to put headphones on, feel free. If you would like to giggle out loud, feel free. My worst nightmare is having admin come in to my classroom on the day that I teach Freud's 5 age-related stages of personality development. And let's go through why. So what Freud believed was that each stage, a different focus of the id's sexual energies would focus on. So remember, the id is our most caveman-like tendencies. And at each stage, a sexual impulse is associated with a specific body zone. So Freud, he studied his own children. He was very into the childhood development of personalities, and you could look into that all you want, but he created these 5 stages, and it's called Freud's psychosexual stages. Okay, and here they are. Yes, I'm going to say them only once, and of course you guys got this on video, but bear with me. So we have the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency stage, and then to wrap it all up, we have the genital stage, which you're like, what is all this? I know. Why would Freud name them these things? Let's find out. So again, this is Freud's theory of child development through personality. So, and we're going to go through each one. So from the birth to age 1, Freud would call this I'm sorry, my friends. Okay, we're just going to go through them all at the same time since my clicker was off. I apologize for that. So looking at this first one, and I apologize for all of the craziness, and maybe I should, here, there you go. So the mouth is the primary focus of pleasure and sensations. And so this would be seen as, for example, babies when they're first born, they literally put everything in their mouth. That's how they're exploring their world, okay? Just similar to a puppy, right? They always want to chew on things, like they're exploring, right? Jeannie, remember when she was locked in her room, the way that she explored the world was by sniffing people, putting things against her face. So what Freud called this was the oral stage, where a lot of, figuring out things was by, either putting things in our mouth or exploring objects, right? And so like the act of feeding. So Freud believed that this was the oral fixation stage, okay, where children learned about the world, right, through figuring out the world by using their mouths. And moving on to age 1 through 3, we have the anal phase. And you're like, Miss H, and I'm like, I know. And so essentially, as you write this down, Freud believed that this was like a big milestone of potty training, right? And, since we are on a mature class, right, there is, all these stages, they can also be considered pleasure centers, or what children do to regress back into a nervous tic. So ages 1 and 3, potty training, just put potty training. My people. Freud's ideas, my friends, Freud's ideas. So potty training, we're being explored with, what does it mean to use the restroom, right? And when we talk about fixation, we'll talk about that later, but those are also interesting. But moving on, we then have age 3 to 6, which is the phallic stage. And this is where, so if anyone's I worked at the children's school, I worked with ages 3 to 5, and I just remember when children would always go around being like, I'm a girl, I have this, I'm a boy, I have this. And, it's where children are curious and who's a, guy, girl, and, what is this? Why does mommy have this and daddy have this, right? So again, this is the stage where that is their primary focus. Again, through Freud's eyes, right? Ages 7 through 11, latency phase. So this is where, I always like to say this is the cootie stage. This is where, this is kind of like late elementary school, early middle school, where like all the boys hang out with each other, all the girls hang out with each other, we hang out with our like same-sex friends, right? And essentially the main focus is on school, sports, other activities. Again, it's just the stage where it's more repressed in Freud's eyes. And then we have our dear adolescence phases. Yep, and for all of my teenagers out there, this is high school, right? So this is as adolescence reaches physical sexual maturity, right? So relationships, all of, sexual urges, those all come about. And through Freud, that is what kind of the main focus is during adolescence, right? And again, my people, if I haven't freaked you out enough already, just remember, this is Freud's lens of his theory. Okay, it's only his lens. A lot of people don't agree with this part of his lens, and this is just what he's studied through the child development. So again, write these down. You can totally abbreviate through this, but just know that Freud was a weird guy, and this is what he came up with. All right, my friends, we're moving on. Oh my gosh, that slide is over. I was stressed. I was like, I have to be videotaped saying that slide. It's hard enough teaching it in class when it's on my screen. Anyway. I hope you guys had some giggles. So a few other things when I talk about Freud's theories, right? So unconscious influences. These are 2 vocab words that connect to the Freudian lens. We have latent content of dreams, right, which we talked about in our dream chapter. And it's a symbolic meaning of a dream essentially what it represents in our unconscious mind, right? So latent content is just what are we trying, what is the symbolic meaning of our dreams images, right? And if you're interested in dreams, psychology actually has a branch. It's called Jungian psychology or Jungian psychology. And it's based off of Carl Jung, who is friends with a bunch of the dream analysis psychologists, right? And he's the one who did a little bit more research on archetypes within dreams. What does this mean when you see this in a dream? So there's lots more research on that. There's also something called the Freudian slip. Slips of the tongue that Freud believed would show our true nature. And I'm just going to give you an example. A Freudian slip would be daddy's girl or mama's boy. And why is that? Let's see. We have the Oedipus complex. So on top of Freud being extremely creepy on his childhood development stages, he also came up with this. He believed a boy's sexual desire for his mother and the feelings of jealousy and hatred for the rival father. So essentially, boys are jealous of their father because they have their mother's attention. And on the other side, for the girls' end, it's called the Electra complex. So if you've ever heard of mama's boy and daddy's girl, it's okay to be called those, but I'm just saying it had a sketchy past. And so if anyone also has not watched Bates Motel with Norman Bates and Norma, his mother, Norma, and she named her son Norman, if that's not a key for anything. If you guys haven't watched that show, it's literally Freud put into a show. So essentially, we'll talk more about it in class. Anyway, okay. Let's talk about fixation. So Freud believed that if a traumatic event occurred in your life, especially in childhood, one could become stuck in a particular stage of psychosexual development. So let me give you an example. Children who used to suck their thumb to make them feel better. Maybe they moved on, maybe they went to kindergarten, they haven't done it in a while. But if it starts up again, it's because it's a comfort. And so when we talk about fixations, when someone fixates on a certain stage of Freud's development through his lens. So for example, Freud would say people who have a smoking habit, or with cigarettes, Freud would call that an oral fixation. Let's see. There's also, they say, when people say like anal retentive, it means people who are controlled and orderly and they're fixated on like control, and that's also where they get the weird root words. But it's really interesting how, fixation where, it's a way of how we not cope, but what am I trying to say? It's essentially where you have like zoned in, like so if a child is constantly putting, things in their mouth that they're not supposed to, it's called an oral fixation, right? But also, as we grow up, there's also the really abnormal aspects of fixation. So for any of my Grey's Anatomy people, there was a guy that went into the ER because he swallowed a bunch of doll heads. And it's because he liked the feeling of them, like, after he went to the restroom, right? And that's all I'm going to say, but that would be a different fixation, right? So Freud believes this all stems from childhood traumas that creates these fixations. Again, my friends, hang in there with me. It's a very Freudian day. So not real quick, but moving on to our next aspect of Freud. We have the introduction to the defense mechanisms, and Freud really is well known for these defense mechanisms and how they play out in people's lives. And so a defense mechanism is the ego's protective methods of reducing anxiety and unconscious distortion of reality. So simpler terms, defense mechanisms are a way that your ego protects itself. Okay. And we talked about this a little bit in memory, but we talked about repression. It's the most basic defense mechanism, most common with children, right? And it's our ability to banish anxiety arousing thoughts, feelings, and memories from our consciousness. And some people cannot bring them back. It's like a black hole in their memory. So it's repressed, right? And it's the ego's way of protecting yourself. We see a lot of repression in children who have been sexually abused, right? Or abuse in general. So again, it's the way of our body protecting itself. And Freud declares it's our ego's job for defense mechanisms of protecting, right? So the next slide is going to be some examples of some basic defense mechanisms. And repression is kind of the most basic, but we're moving on from repression. So defense mechanisms, let's see what we have. And again, I know, my friends, I do want you to write this down. So I do want you to make this table. And again, all through the psychoanalytical theory. And so here are 6 more examples of defense mechanisms that these are ways to process and avoid anxiety feeling thoughts and feelings. And you may see this in people you know. And I'll try to give examples. So first one, we have regression. So the defense mechanism of regression is when we retreat to a more infantile stage of the psychosexual stages. So let me give you an example. If Tommy, who's a 5-year-old, he used to suck his thumb a lot when he was nervous, right? But then it kind of went away, right? But right when he was on his way to kindergarten, he started to suck his thumb again. He regressed to an earlier stage in his life to something that brought him peace. So for anyone who bites their nails or things that you may have done when you were younger and it only really come out when you're anxious or nervous, that's regression, right? So for example, when a middle schooler starts to wet the bed again, right? It's a regression because that usually happens earlier on. It could be many things, but usually the thumb sucking is a pretty good, giveaway. So, if a children ever goes back into earlier stages of comfort, it's usually because there's something that is making them anxious, right? So regression is just going backward in the psychosexual stages, okay? And then we have reaction formation. Okay. So reaction formation is when we switch unacceptable impulses into their opposite. Have you ever heard of killing your enemy with happiness or with kill them with kindness? It's the same aspect. So my people, let me tell you. So my reaction so if someone falls or trips or gets hurt in a game, my immediate reaction is to laugh. It's awful. I can't help myself. But it's the exact opposite of what I'm supposed to be portraying. So reaction formation is essentially, people who you might be really angry at Sally, and then all of a sudden you're really, really super nice and friendly, right? But it's a defense mechanism to avoid what you're actually feeling, right? So again, kill them with kindness. It's kind of where I believe that terminology may have came from. In my own opinion, that's my own thoughts. But anyway, and then we have projection. I just think of, I used to, I love teaching this in class because I always have examples from my mother for each of these. But anyway, let's talk about projection. So projection is the defense mechanism where one disguises their own threatening impulses by attributing them to others. So for example, if let's see, let me try to think. If Sally, so say Sally has the impulse to steal from grocery stores, right? She's pocketing food, right? What her defense mechanism would do is it would essentially attribute the same things to other people. So she would say, Tommy and whoever steals from the grocery store too, and so essentially your own impulses, you're attributing to other people as well, so you're not alone. So you're not the only one that's stealing from grocery stores. You're not the only one who's shoplifting, right? So, and again, so right? So another phrase is a thief thinks everyone else is a thief. right? So you attribute your own impulses to saying, oh, other people have those impulses too, right? So it makes it okay. Rationalization is the one we all use a lot. And this is me trying to rationalize saying, oh, I only told myself I would eat out once this week. And then it's like, oh, but Chick-fil-A is right there. And I just got like a pay raise or something, right? Rationalization. So offering a self-justifying explanation in place of a real, more threatening reason for one's actions. So for example, a habitual drinker will say, oh, I only drink to be sociable, right? And so let me just kind of talk about that one a little more, right? So people who start to develop some alcoholic tendencies, along the way, they will say things like, oh, I only drink a lot when I'm, with other friends. Oh, I only have, one or two beers by myself, right? So it's all this rationalization that tends to lead to bigger or avoiding more unconscious things that are happening, right? So again, it's the rationalization, it's you justifying to yourself, right? For me, a lot of the time it's like, oh, I'm justifying why I need a Starbucks when I have coffee at home, right? So rationalization is a very, very common one. Displacement. This one I have named after my mother, Jenna. And you guys, she knows I talk about her, but this is all good and fun after we're done living together. So we can talk about this now that we no longer live under the same roof, but displacement. And my people, if you're in a relationship, you may have done this to your significant other as well, or your friends. So displacement is shifting a sexual or aggressive, it could be, but mostly let's think aggressive, right? Impulse towards a more acceptable or less threatening object or person. So have you ever experienced where your parents are angry at your other sibling, right? So say my parents, this would happen all the time. My parents would be mad at my brother for him not doing his chores, getting bad grades, and then all of a sudden, my mother walks into my room and starts yelling at me. And I'm like, what did I do? Like, I just have been working on my homework. I've been doing nothing. I've been a good student, right? Displacement is you're channeling the anger and putting it towards someone else who may not be able to fight back as much, or I can't, obviously my mom is like the dictator, right? So it's like, I just do what she does, what she says. But another example, right? The little girl kicks the family dog after the mother sends her to her room. She's displacing her anger from her mother onto the dog, right? Which no one ever should kick their dogs, but just saying. So displacement, if you've ever displaced your anger, and usually people tend to display their anger. So for example, I'd be really mad at my mom, and I would go visit Aaron, boyfriend at the time, now fiance, and he would just sit there and I would just be snappy. I would be angry and he would just, he's bless his soul, but he would just let me say what I needed to say. And then I realized that I was just displacing my anger onto someone who had nothing to do with it, right? So again, displacement. And then last but not least, my favorite, we have absolute denial. Pleading the fifth. So refusing to believe or even perceive painful realities. People, especially with cheating, right, in a relationship. So a partner denies evidence of his loved one's affair, even if he may already have, evidence. So denial, it's part of our stages of grief, right? We just deny, right? It's very similar to belief perseverance of, even if it gets debunked, you might still, believe. And yeah, denial is a strong defense mechanism. Yep. Anyway, okay, moving on. So real quick, a little bit into dream analysis. We're not going too much into it. We're still under a Freudian lens. We're still under module 60. This is probably one of the more hefty modules. So this video will probably be most likely on the bigger end compared to the other ones. But this is kind of the big sections of the personality unit. So dream analysis, right? There's another method to analyze the unconscious mind is through interpreting the contents of dreams. All you really need to know is a few of these things. So neo-Freudians are people who came after Freud that believe in certain aspects of his theories, but not in others. So a lot of neo-Freudians didn't believe in his child sexual stages that he published, but a lot of people still use id, ego, and superego. So that's why they're called neo-Freudians. They took Freud's work and they branched out of it. They branched off of it, right? So Alfred Adler, he's a really big neo-Freudian. He believed that in childhood tension, however, these tensions were social in nature. He didn't believe that they were sexual. So while Freud really focused in on the sexual aspects, Adler said, no, I think it's more of a social nature, right? So a child struggles with inferiority complex during the growth and strives for power in his friendships or whatever, right? So Adler believed that the stages of personality had to do more with the social aspect and not the sexual aspect, which was a really big one for a lot of neo-Freudians. They did not believe in half the things that Freud talked about sexually, right? Another neo-Freudian, guys, her last name is not pronounced how you think it is. It's Horney. And our textbook has a like a little parentheses of how to pronounce it, because I guess they've had many people ask. But could you imagine that being your last name? Anyway, so Horney. So she is a really big. She was like kind of like the first feminist when it came to, all these men talking about psychology, and she believed that in the social aspects of childhood, when it came to growth and development, that they're trying to overcome a sense of helplessness. So she believed that they wanted to feel, powerful and important. And so, again, she really tried to advocate more on the female lens and not have a male-dominated lens back in the day, especially. One last neo-Freudian is Jung. So he's the one who's the Jungian psychology. He is the one who is the founder of archetypes. So right next to his name, he is the dream analysis for psychology. So Jung believed in the collective unconscious, where people have similar. So people who dream about water all have a certain archetype to it, right? So archetypes are symbolic images that appear in dreams all across the world. So there is an archetype for if you see water in your dream. There's an archetype for if you can't seem to run fast enough in a dream, right? So there is a collective unconscious that we all kind of share off of, and that is essentially the basis of Jungian dream psychology or dream analysis. So he's the one who branched out into the dream analysis in psychology. And he was a neo-Freudian as well. So real quick, before we wrap up the super creepy module, I know my friends, you're like, Ms. H, like if you guys hung in this long, you guys got this, I promise. There's a reason we have to teach it. But anyway, so assessing the psychoanalytical perspective, we had four little grapes. Lack of empirical evidence, my friends. It's Freud. He studied his children. And let's not think too much into that, okay? Conflicts with current research. Just like a lot of other neo-Freudians said, the sexual aspect may not be as dominant as Freud originally thought. Lack of scientific testability, and last but not least, a very strong emphasis on male prototypes. Freud didn't separate the genders a lot when it came to the psychosexual phases. And so that's also where he got a lot of criticism from. And so again, concepts too vague, right? Okay, and we don't need to write all these down. I just wanted you guys to write the main title. And one last thing before we finish up. So just assessing the unconscious and the process, there's just two ways to test personality under the psychoanalytical lens. And it's usually by taking a thematic appreciation test, which is called TAT, or the Rorschach ink blot test, which you might see in some criminal shows or some episodes that you saw in other series. So real quick, the Rorschach ink blot test looks like this, and it's essentially, let me go through the steps. This is how, it's a personality test that judges what you see within this randomness. So essentially how it works is, step one, a person would interpret an ambiguous image. Step two, use this to assess motives, conflict, psychological defenses, personality traits. So for example, if you see two angry people arguing, the psychologist would go on that, because essentially whatever ambiguous images we see, it usually is portrayed with what we're already trying to look for, right? So it's a way to get into our mind. And then it's scored subjectively, right? So that's one way. That's one personality test. And number two, This is what we would usually do in class, but for this one, I just want you guys to write down this top little part, which is the TAT test. It's a projective test in which people express their inner feelings and interests through storytelling. And so if we were in class, maybe we'll do this for one of our brainstorm days. But I would have you guys look at this image and in your table groups, come up with a story. And so, if some groups said, oh, clearly, he was leaving her for another woman. And then, you can see how the psychologist would see these conflicts in your stories that you create, and they would try to dig more into it. Some groups have said that the woman was telling him how much of a piece of crap he was, right? Or anyway, all these things, but they give us an into the mind about how you storytell and what you focus on. And it's a little bit of reverse psychology. So again, this is another way. But clearly there's some criticisms, right? And this is our last slide for our first module. And criticism include, right, it's an unscientific basis because it cannot be proved. When we talk about valid, if something is valid, is it actually measuring what it claims to measure? Is it actually measuring our personality? Or is it even reliable with giving us consistent results over time, right? Because essentially every person who looks at that image will give you a different pathway. All right, my friends, we got through the creepy, weird one. I promise everything else won't be as creepy, but we got through Freud for the personality, and I will see you for our next module.